Iowa Soybean Association is driven to deliver for Iowa's 40,000 soybean farmers. We're proud to provide objective agronomic research, a helping hand with soil and water stewardship, and timely industry news powered by the Soybean Checkoff. Learn more at iasoybeans.com.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Yeager. This is the MTOM Show podcast, a production of Iowa PBS and the Market to Market TV show. Today, we are going to talk about transitions from being an owner to an operator to a farm hand. Maybe you're the upcoming farmer looking for an opportunity. Maybe you're that new farmer and you are trying to find someone to help you answer some questions. It's about transitions. Clint Fischer from South Dakota and the CEO of Braintrust Ag is going to talk about his story and how he formulated this idea. He was in ag retail for a number of times, tried a couple of things that maybe didn't quite work out the way he wanted to. So he went to law school, and we're going to talk how Braintrust was born. One thing that he has found is partnering, and maybe it's that mentor-mentee. Maybe it's a peer group. Remember, a peer group isn't necessarily your neighbor, because you don't want to always tell your neighbor that, hey, I'm thinking of buying that 40, and then your neighbor goes in and buys the 40 ahead of you. We'll talk about some of that transition, but also those discussions of someone who might have reached a certain age and it's time to do something next and bring in someone with a little different energy and a different scope of things. And how does that look? We'll talk about navigating some of those tough decisions and conversations that need to happen at some point. We all know there's family dynamics involved, and sometimes the easiest decision is not always the one that is the one that needs to be made. Sometimes easy is hard and hard is easy. Let's talk to Clint now. If you have any feedback for me, send me an email at paul.yeager@iowapbs.org. I love hearing from you. New episodes come out each and every Tuesday. Now let's get to our discussion. All right, Clint, when you look at the weather map, who has more snow, you or those crazy Iowans?
You know, I think for once they do. You know, we were on the north end of it, and we got some cold, but not near the inches that they got. So
you had a harder Christmas, though.
We did. Yes, that was last couple of years, right around Christmas time. It seems we'll get hit with something and delays everybody's travel. And of course, this year that storm that hit down south was impacting this Brookings, South Dakota area pretty significantly because half the town was down in Frisco, Texas for the national championship game, and they weren't able to come back. So it was kind of a ghost town around here for a while. Did you have rooting interest in that game? Sorry? Did you have rooting interest? Like, is SDSU your team, or you're like, no, they beat the Bison, I'm done? I live near Brookings, work here in Brookings, and graduated from SDSU many years ago. And so quite a significant interest in the team, and it's been a great couple of years. Of course, we have an ongoing rivalry with our neighbors to the north in North Dakota State, and very excited to see SDSU win 2 back-to-back national championships now. So kind of sounds the way they were at North Dakota, winning their back-to-back in many years. They had quite the dynasty going. So we'll see if we can keep it up down here in Brookings. Where did you, before you went to SDSU, where were you living? So I grew up here in eastern South Dakota on a small farm, kind of a glorified hobby farm, really. Dad was an ag banker his whole career, and ended up going. So out of high school, I went down to University of Sioux Falls, down in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, to play football down there. Decided after 3 years to get an ag degree. So I transferred up to SDSU for ag business, graduated from there. Following that, then I spent 10 years in ag retail, managing various feed, fertilizer, seed, chemical locations here around the area. Also starting a couple of businesses. Some were fairly successful, a handful significantly flopped. Learned a lot more from the flops than from the successful ones. And then in 2019, decided to go to law school. and really work more on the farm succession, transition side of things, estate planning. So went to law school in 2019. So I was the old non-traditional student in class. There were a couple of us, but we're the ones that ask too many questions in class, and everybody wants us to shut up. So
I get it. Been there, done that. All right, Clint, you gave me about 4 things to follow up on. First, what position in football?
So I was tight end and then a little bit of fullback when needed.
And then that was at USF?
That was at USF, yep.
So now was the coach there at the time the guy who's now at Alabama?
Yes, sir.
So you played for DeBoer?
Yeah, so my freshman year was his first year as head coach. So he's the one who recruited me, and we went I was with the team in 2006 when we won a national championship. And then I had left before they won again in 2008. And so I got to play for DeBoer his first years of coaching and watched him move on ultimately to Alabama. So yeah, it's an incredible story for him. And of course, he's a South Dakota born and raised in Millbank, success story. So pretty fun to watch.
And his OC, we like to take claim in Iowa, and he was working at a hog farm.
Yeah.
When he went up to Sioux Falls when DeBoer called. So, yes, we have some interest in there. All right. The flops teach you more about life. So, as a salesman, what did you like about doing ag retail?
The sales I was okay at. More specifically, I was the business manager side, kind of the behind the scenes. Of course, when you're running a 1 or a 2-man shop, you wear all the hats. You learn all the aspects from, sales, procurement, delivery, and all the business management side of things too. What I enjoyed about that is I learned quickly. I enjoy working one-on-one with ag operators, various different sizes. Specifically, I kind of have leaned towards the newer beginning, kind of younger, in the ag world, not necessarily by age, but by experience. And then that kind of led me to understanding, what are some of the challenges that are outside the agronomy world, outside the livestock nutrition world, outside the markets, outside the weather. And a lot of it is kind of the legal aspects, risk management aspects, and then, is treating these farm operations as a business, versus just a lifestyle.
At what point did something click there? Because you also just dropped a couple of hints in that answer that sound like what it is you're doing today. At some point, did you have like a book to the side and you're like, I think I eventually could do this. Is that accurate?
That's fairly accurate. Essentially, I've always been keen towards business, enjoying that aspect of things, the numbers side. And I've also just been generally curious. And so I ask a lot of questions, maybe sometimes too many for folks.
But that guy in the law class who's asking too many questions, right. Yes, right. Matching up, okay.
But, trying to understand, coming not from a production ag farm, but just from a kind of a small hobby operation, trying to understand the ins and outs and the dollars and cents of production ag. So talking with farmers, taking a step further from just, making a sale, and trying to understand, how can any young person break into ag if they don't have an operation to take over? And so that was kind of what I was trying to get at and understand. And if you ask my wife, she'll say, if I could change my trajectory, I'd just be a farmer today. And which I could, however, she might not be too keen on, on taking on that risk at this stage of our lives. But so generally understanding what are my skills and how can I apply those into ag, which has really been my passion, led me to working one-on-one with some folks, prior to law school, just helping them understand some basics of finance, some basics of, even on the personal finance side, what is a household budget? Why should that be separate from our our farm operation. How do I treat this thing really as a business? Because that's what I was taught and what I was learning through my other experiences. And so just kind of advising some newer folks in ag led me to understanding that's generally the direction that I wanted to go career-wise. I didn't, my last ag retail job was managing a small fertilizer plant. And I realized that I just didn't want to sling fertilizer for the rest of my life. And time for a change, which had prompted me to go into law school and kind of take that path.
The law school aspect, there's many different areas to get into law. Was there a specific one you had in mind, and is that how you graduated with that same entrance and exit?
Sure. Yes and no. So generally, there's a couple ways to look at law school. One is litigation, which is what everybody sees on TV, whether it's civil or criminal, when you're in the courtroom. That never really appealed to me. I was more focused on the business transactional side of things. And so you're right. There's countless areas of law to go into, and you can specialize in many different areas. So for me, I preferred the behind the scenes, the drafting of contracts, the boring stuff that doesn't make it on TV and movies, but generally pays the bills. And so that I kind of narrowed it down to that right off the bat. And then I recognized, I have an interest in real estate. I have an interest in farm operations. Within agricultural law, there's a path to go towards kind of environmental law, things of that nature, which didn't necessarily appeal to me. I wanted to stick more on the kind of the business, the legacy side of things. So then that brings us to wills and trusts and estate planning. And so that was a good combination of being able to apply farm with kind of the transactional, side of things. And, the other kind of direction that many will go is really into tax law, because we all recognize how important and impactful tax is in agriculture and in business in general. And frankly, as a public accounting minor at USF, I realized I didn't want to be a CPA. I didn't want to be a bean counter, and so I really focused on the estate, farm succession path. So in law school, I went to the University of South Dakota down in Vermilion. And so there's a limited number of electives, that you can take. And of course I got to experience law school during the COVID time, where we went remote for the first time ever, which was beneficial to my family, a lot less commute, but it limited a little bit of the electives that we can take. So tried to focus, significantly on the the transactional, the wills and trusts, that kind of thing. But leaving there with a general knowledge of law, because you need that to pass the bar exam.
At what point was Braintrust born then?
That was it was while I was studying for the bar exam. I was working one-on-one with some folks, helping put together farm transition plans, and also helping on the kind of the business management, consulting, advising side of things. And what ended up happening was I was talking with somebody, and they said, hey, there's this big kind of ag crowd on Twitter. At the time, it was Twitter. And they said, you should, post some of your ideas and stuff on there. And I really took a liking to kind of that form of written content. And so I started posting some ideas on there and gained some engagement through that, which led to a lot of people asking some frequent questions. And so questions that I want to help, I want to be helpful, I want to answer. However, they don't really rise to the level of let's work one-on-one, let's really dive into this project specifically. So ultimately, Braintrust Ag came about as an idea for just being able to answer some of those frequently asked questions and point people into a direction of here's some resources, here's some things that I've put together, here's some things that I've found through other extension services. Download these resources, do some of your own homework, but here I'm going to compile these things for you. And that's ultimately kind of what I thought it was going to be, was just a library of resources and, maybe some content. But what I quickly learned a few months into it was that the true value of Braintrust Ag, as I see it now and as it's evolving, is really the peer group atmosphere. And so what we're trying to accomplish and what members are really quite dedicated to is kind of cutting through the noise that you would see in Facebook groups and on Twitter and on these other really open settings where there's a lot of discussion about the weather, there's a lot of discussion about the markets. And it's diving more into how can I be a business manager for my farm, for my ranch, and how do I transition this thing to either the younger generation or to an employee who's coming on. What can I set up now that in 10 years I won't look back and regret not doing anything?
Well, I think, Clint, what you're saying there is that farming is a business and you have to know your cost of production. Matt Bennett is our analyst. I've told this story on this podcast before. My very first conversation with Matt was, he goes, I think what I bring as an analyst or as an advisor is I ask Clint, what is your cost of production? And if you don't know it, you need to go do your homework and then come back and we'll talk.
Yeah.
So that's always the first part of a business, is understanding what your value is. But Clint, how many farmers, they're not usually the ones on Twitter, but there's plenty of them that are on X that might be good farmers, but they're not very good at business. There's those farmers that exist. So do you target those that maybe are good at business and can get better? Or are you trying to find that one who, hey, you need to think about this more of a business and the financial planning that needs to go forward to make your operation for now and for later beneficial to you and your family?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. And what I found, the people who are willing to learn, who are open-minded and want to really improve their business management skills are those who are generally a little younger, who have a little smaller operation. They have to be scrappy, right? There's not a lot of cushion for them to make make some errors or just not be really dialed into their numbers. And what they're hungry for is seeing other entrepreneurs in other industries having kind of these peer groups where they can commiserate, they can learn from each other, they can bounce ideas back and forth. One of the common things I discuss is this concept of an ag adjacent side hustle for young people. And basically it's saying, hey, we're going to bring on, we're going to take what is maybe a cost center to a lot of operations, and let's try to see if we can turn it into a profit center. An example would be, say, for instance, manure hauling. Okay, so I know I have manure on my farm. I need it spread. Now, is this something that I can buy or rent the equipment for and do it for my own operation and also for other operations? And now I'm complementing my farm, but I'm also bringing in some income. I'm justifying this equipment. And there's many, many different examples of that. But it's the kind of thinking that is maybe a little bit not, this is how grandpa did it, this is how dad did it, and so this is how I'm going to do it. And so it's those types of people who are, I guess, kind of willing to look a little bit outside the box. They know they want to farm, but they know that farming in 2024 is going to look a lot different than it did in 2004 and 1984. And so maybe it's more leased ground, less ground ownership. It's just the people who are willing. And so really it's not age, it's not experience. It's the open-mindedness and the willingness to share their experiences too. That's the other people I'm trying to target, because I don't know many of the answers. And so I'm trying to learn as well from other members within the group. And that's why I really think the value is the peer group setting where, every other week we have a Zoom call where members can come in and just specific topics. Once a month we'll bring on an expert that they can ask their questions to. We just yesterday we had one on grain merchandising, and you know, and she's just dynamic and really was helpful to understand the basics, the things that I frankly didn't know, you know, a lot of those pieces. And so it's more targeted to how are we treating this as a business, and how are we treating this as a business as it compares to other industries too. You know, where are we investing the capital when we could, you know, there's a lot of opportunity cost involved in agriculture. You know, we can invest outside the farm, maybe get a better return, bring it back to the farm. Just looking at those different opportunities from other people who have done it, who might not be your next door neighbor. And that's one of the beauties, I think, of internet, online, peer group setting, is that, you know, right now there's 30 plus states kind of represented in Braintrust Ag. And so no longer is it just going to the coffee shop and trying to hold your secrets close because you don't want your neighbor to know what you're doing successfully so that they come in and swoop some land from you. You know, now it's, you know, this is working in Oklahoma, this is working in Iowa, you know, this is in North Carolina. Can we apply some of those principles here? And we're not worried about that competition factor.
Well,
you know,
we talk about internally here of farmers need to maybe look at that whole, your neighbor isn't necessarily your competition because they are not in the same boat as you, because there's a good chance that the guy who owns, or the corporation that owns that 120 across the road, they're leveraged pretty high and they need it to pay off this way. Whereas the neighbor over here is maybe in a much more similar conversation and might be the one that steals that land from you if they swoop into the landowner, the surviving landowner, and
right.
with the monkey bread first to offer as a peace offering. So yes, there's those types of things. Are you finding that peer groups are more forgiving of mistakes? Or we feel more open to sharing in a peer group than we would, say, at a neighborhood meeting in our county or in our city?
I've seen that the willingness to share has really been quite enjoyable to see, frankly, because I was a little concerned, you know, with just that idea that, you know, I don't want to give away some secret that has worked for me, you know, to my quote unquote competition, like you said. But I have seen that those who are willing to share are also the ones who are willing to make the connections, kind of the mentorship relationship, you know. And what I really like about Braintrust so far, you know, is relatively new, and we've got folks who are a few retired farmers who have been very successful over the years, and we've got some guys who are in their late teens looking to say, hey, where are these opportunities at? And just to be able to sit back and kind of watch, you know, those who are inquisitive and asking the right types of questions to these guys who have been there, done that, you know, and to see them just be willing and open and free with their information to share kind of with that next generation or even two generations removed. You know, it's fun to watch, but it's also, you know, gives me a lot of hope for that next generation. Because really, you know, on a call the other day, you know, somebody said, you know, Clint, your shtick is really trying to help those younger guys find that opportunity. And through doing that, you're also helping that owner generation to transition their farm business, their operation, their assets down. And I didn't mind that. You know, you can pigeonhole me in that world because, you know, I'm an advocate of opportunities for the next generation, whether it's within the family or not, to come in and keep these farms as family farms and ranches, to keep these operations, you know, from the concept of growth is the only way. Either you're growing or you're dying, and I disagree with that. You know, just that general mindset. And so I think that there's a lot of young, hungry people interested in being able to farm. And what does that look like in 2024? Well, it's going to be different than what Grandpa and Dad did. We just know that.
Farming can be a very lonely, isolated industry if you let it. You are out there on that tractor all day doing something. No one's around. And if you are not on auto steer and not on Twitter or not on a phone call, you really have no one to bounce off, and you're experimenting. You do need to have somebody to go talk to. Send them a picture, send them a video, send them whatever back and forth. I think that's a valuable service. And it sounds like you agree, because that's kind of what, as you said, you've enjoyed your pigeonholing of being able to connect those people.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things also that's evolved through this experience is this concept of retiring. Some people don't like the word retiring. Call them sunsetting operators, owner operators, who might not have a successor to take over. Now, what I'm finding is there's a handful of them out there, and I'm hopeful that there's more and more, as this thing evolves, who say, I could either just sell all my equipment, have a farm sale, and rent out my ground and just ride off into the sunset. Or I could just sell everything for parts to the highest bidder and go, live down south somewhere. But there are a handful who say, hey, I've built this legacy, this farming operation, this really, it's more than just a business to me, because I've put so much effort and time and it's maybe passed down from generations. And now here I sit with no kids who are interested in taking over. And, but I want to give some other young person that opportunity. And so I'm actually working with one right now in Oklahoma. And, I posted a couple of things about that. Basically, we're looking for this employee to come in, understand the ropes, learn the aspects, and eventually it's a employee to ownership opportunity for this young person to come in. It takes a special owner operator to want to mentor, to have kind of the patience of the 5 to 7 year transition plan. But it's meaningful to them to keep that legacy going and to give somebody else an opportunity, a young person coming in. And so, and I've had a few other people since then reach out about, inquiring, how can we maybe do that, with our operation? And that's hopeful to me, me being fairly passionate about getting that next generation to come in, and farm. I think that we're going to see more and more of that. At least I'm hopeful that we see more of that aspect.
Because frankly, Clint, you've got, let's just say, somebody who's got 10,000 acres, 5,000 acres, and they don't want to transition it on a sale. They want to, they're adding to that to make it 20 at the end when they cannot keep farming. Say they're north of 70, 80, and they're the ones who are buying because they're the ones with the capital to go to the bank to write the check and buy the land. Is that detrimental when someone's not willing to parse things out and bring in the next generation for agriculture?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily detrimental, because I don't want to, place them in a negative light. But what I would say is that they are, I guess, furthering kind of the consolidation, you might say, of some of these operations, of some of the land base. Because, one of the things it's common knowledge that the cost of land is one of the huge barriers to entry for somebody coming in. And so when we see, a lot of these REITs, a lot of investment groups, outside, whether it's foreign or, domestic investors who are, picking up some of that land, like what you kind of explained, they would have the resources to come in and tell that 70-year-old gentleman, we'll go ahead and make an offer on this whole parcel, all 5,000 acres, because we need it for our big public REIT. That limits opportunities for the younger person. It opens up maybe some rental potential. And I'm always try to stress that you can be a farmer by renting ground. You don't have to own ground to be a quote unquote farmer. It's if you're in that boat, this is where kind of my legal background would come into place. We're going to put in a nice lease. We're going to put in some protections in this lease. We might use a right of first refusal, something in this lease, or an option to purchase. But let's negotiate. Let's look at maybe some various flex rents some sharecrop, we can get creative with these leases. So we don't necessarily have to own the ground in order to farm it. But I would say that it's limiting in the fact that, that 70-year-old example, not necessarily providing what he could be providing 3 opportunities to 3 young families to come in, and that's not happening. And so it would be limiting in that aspect. Yeah.
Well, let's go to a little different scenario here then. Say you have that relative who's 75, 80, who is not, there's no known successor. No one, I think you mentioned one of those, there's no one interested. How do you, and maybe you're a distant relative, and how do you have that conversation? How do you start that dialogue with someone? Hey, have you thought about what's next? Do you have a plan? Because let's face it, there's people who are going to get extremely defensive real quick when you try to start meddling in their business.
That is one of the more common questions that I get asked, and is one of the trickier ones to answer, because everybody's got the family dynamics and years and years and years of either great relationships or sour relationships. And so how do we have that conversation? Generally speaking, I like to have that younger generation approach the older generation with this kind of framework in mind. It's saying, especially if they have their own operation and they just don't know what's going to happen with the land base or with the equipment, the older generation just doesn't talk about it. Anytime it's brought up, it gets shot down.
What? Whoa. You're saying that maybe an old farmer might not talk about something important like that? That's breaking news, Clint. Let's sound the alarm. Sorry, keep going.
Once or twice I've seen it happen. But really the approach is this. If I'm in that younger generation shoes, I'm saying, I'm looking out for my family. I'm looking to protect what I've built, whether that's part of the operation or not. And part of being a good steward of my operation and part of being a good, business owner for my family is understanding and planning the future. And so, dad, uncle, whoever it is, I'm looking at planning out, 5, 10, 15, 20 years for my operation right now, and I like to say, say that you talk to me, say that you talk to a third party, right? That just generally neutralizes things. I was talking with a guy who works with this kind of thing, and he really encouraged me to see, part of my 5, 10, 20-year plan is, I don't know, what place I have in your future plans. And so you just kind of bring it up as, hey, I'm looking out for my family. I need to plan this to be a good business person. And you approach it with humility and humble, and with the approach that says, I'm not expecting anything. I'm not anticipating to receive anything, but to be, to have a well thought out plan. I just need to know whether there's anything on the table here or not, or how things are going to look. But really I think it's key to approach it that I'm not entitled to anything here, and I think that, if you have that attitude going into it, understanding that, hey, I'm looking out for my family here, then generally they're a little bit more willing to open up. Not all the time. And I've heard some people say, my dad said, well, you'll find out when I pass away, and if that's the case, then so be it. And then that's when I tell that younger generation, okay, then you can assume that you're getting nothing.
Which is
work
probably
on that basis, and then the rest is a windfall. Operate on that basis, and then the rest would be a windfall.
And I think there's too many that end up in that. Well, maybe not too many that end up in that expectation. I think if you approach it from, I'm not expecting anything, but let's look at the tax ramifications here. You want to go back to money, uncle, grandpa, grandma, whatever. If we worry about this after you die, that's a heck of a tax burden to us. Not only are you not giving me anything, you're doing some not nice things to me from the other side there. This can be, there's trust opportunities. There's there are legal options and things, and we could do a whole contract law episode about trusts and things like that, Clint. I'm sure we really make you then you'd bill us for that 30 minutes of time, and we'd really make it work. So I guess I'll end it here, Clint, because yes, anybody can contact you at Braintrust and run those common questions to you. But generally speaking, what is something families, we just finished the holidays. I always kind of do some of these interviews ahead of the holidays. Here's a conversation you can have at Christmas. Right. Okay, we don't have that burden of the holidays. But what's that conversation maybe we should be looking at if we're not directly tied to agriculture, or we are, and we need to have this conversation because we need to have it?
First and foremost, I would just strongly encourage the owner generation to be the ones to initiate it. That conversation goes something like, here's what our plan is, or we don't have a plan and we are working on putting a plan together, and getting everybody in that room, and it's saying, here's our plan. You may or may not agree with it. You don't have to like it. But ultimately, these are our assets that we're going to pass along in this manner. We have some, farm kids. We have some off-farm kids. Here's our current plan. This could change depending on, nursing home stays. If we buy a house in Arizona, things could change. But as of right now, here's what our plan is. Any questions? As simple as that. Now, that's assuming that there is, some type of a plan in place. If there is no plan in place, that's what I really encourage, reaching out to somebody like myself, or, a good trust and estate attorney. Even, some CPAs can give you some good, tax guidance and referrals. But whenever I work with a farm transition, there's a couple of key things that are just right off the bat. The first thing is taking a complete inventory. What do we own and how do we own it? How are things legally titled? Just because when we dig into that, we find out a lot of hidden, potential pitfalls that could happen with just that one exercise. So that's step number one. Step number two is we sit down separately. The owner generation, we're going to list out what are our goals and objectives. And then the successor generation, what are our goals and objectives? Separate rooms, not together, right? These are what you see happening in the future. Now you can take these two sheets of goals and objectives, put them together and see what things line up and what things don't line up. And oftentimes there's going to be a few that do line up, but there's a lot that don't. Now, those are areas that we need to open up the communication on. And then that's when that family meeting needs to happen. And then we can collaborate, depending on the relationship dynamics. But that's the approach that goes into it, not saying, hey, I don't have a plan. What do you kids think should happen to this stuff? And then you have, husbands and wives and in-laws that all have opinions. And that's when things can get messy. And then it becomes I don't want to deal with this. It's uncomfortable. There's conflict surrounding this. I'm going to kick this can down the road until eventually there's no more road to kick the can down.
You get to the T intersection.
Yeah.
And it's a dead end if you go forward. You're going to have to go one way or the other. Clint, there's a whole lot more we could dive into, but this is a great start to have that conversation. I appreciate the time and the insight on what it is that you do. Thank you, Clint.
Appreciate you having me.
Thank you for watching. New episodes each and every Tuesday here on the MTOM Show podcast, a production of Iowa PBS. If you have feedback for the show or me, you can also send an email to market@iowapbs.org. Thank you. Bye-bye.